why doesn't Russia change its tactics on the battlefield and go more after command and control centers, go after the leadership? Because to me, it seems cruel for Russia to grind down the Ukraine military the way they have, because when we know that most of these soldiers do not want to fight. We see the forced conscription. We know that they don't want to be involved in this war, but they're the ones dying.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a difficult question. One thing is, it's not clear, for example, that decapitation strikes would, in the end, really change the orientation of the leadership. I mean,
well, maybe if they do a couple to just scare the pants off Zelensky, and he's like, okay, let's settle this, to show that, look, we can get you.
Right.
Why are we killing all these, boys that are in these trenches in the front lines?
Right. Yeah. I know people have made that argument, and, I don't dismiss it. But I'm not nearly as confident as they are in general that this would actually have a beneficial effect. I mean, you just think about the decapitation strikes that Israel has carried out against its adversaries. It hasn't changed. It hasn't eliminated the organizations. They're still there. They're still opposed to Israel.
It's not comparable, though, I think, right? When Israel carries out these strikes in Iran or Yemen, they're not unpopular government. It has the opposite effect because they know who the enemy is. Here in Ukraine, it's not. We know that the vast majority of people want this war to end, but their government won't end it. So it's a completely different, I think, environment.
Yeah, it is different. Yeah, you're right. It's different. I don't know, but I'm still not confident that it really would succeed in bringing about, a helpful change of government. We could, in fact, maybe the Banderites, which is the real extreme Banderites, the self-proclaimed Banderites, would just seize power, and things would get even worse.
I would say 3 years of grinding down the Ukrainian military, sure, it's been effective. You've really weakened also NATO, but I mean, you've killed so many people.
Yeah, no, I understand. Again, that's an argument that, Jim Jatras makes, and I see his point. I'm just not sure. Maybe this is something that the Russians have looked at and they've assessed that it's not going to help the situation. It's just not a real option. I imagine that's something that they are watching very, very closely. Again, perhaps I'm just being too willing to trust in or defer to the wisdom of the Russian military in this respect, the Russian leadership. Perhaps this is something they should have done before, but I'm not confident about it. It is a risky undertaking that could involve, let's say, many civilian casualties and really rapidly raise the temperature, considered to be very provocative by the NATO, and could invite, NATO, direct NATO involvement. There are all those risks that you have to consider. But it might be worth it. Again, there's risks not doing that, as again Jim Jatras points out. He acknowledges that there is a risk. There is a very serious risk,
right.
But not doing it, going at it slowly is also risky, and it gives NATO a chance to actually build up its forces and maybe to intervene more forcefully in the future. I don't have an easy answer to that. I see the point, but I'm not sure. I'm not convinced that it's really the way to go.
Yeah, I mean, just if we take a look at these past 3 years, it's just been horrific in terms of the human cost.
Yeah.
And then, but also in terms of just escalation and future risks, where we are now is a lot worse than we were 3 years ago in terms of attempts of nuclear war. It hasn't reduced the risk that much because we don't exercise the leverage that we have over Ukraine to end it. It's clear that this is, and I guess at the end of the day, maybe this is all why it's so important, is that the significance of this war is that I think when this war ends, it will establish whether or not there is a U.S. hegemon anymore. Do you think that is truly the significance of it, and that is what is permeated the ruling elite in the West? And so they just can't back down because they know that this is the end if they do. Is that where we are?
Well, that seems to be where they are. Or I think that's the way they're thinking about it, and that's why they find it impossible to actually make any compromises. Again, I think it's very foolish for various reasons. In the end, they'll lose even more badly because they refuse to negotiate a solution. If they had negotiated it before, let's say, again, the launch of the SMO, when the Russians were clearly, offering, to negotiate, to have a negotiation to avert war. If they had taken that offer at that point and worked out something, again, I think there would have been very little loss of Western prestige. I think in the end there would have been none. But I think in their own minds they couldn't do that because this is something that they said, because it would be to acknowledge that Russia was, in essence, a real rival, to accept that they were a great power, and that was it was agreed upon among them. I think firmly believe that Russia was not a great power, and we cannot acknowledge them as such. It's still Russia of the 1990s, and they simply have to accept what we decide. We can't now say, okay, make this adjustment. They are a great power. And so we ended up with the war, unfortunately, and now it's continued, and they simply have not been able to back off from that position.
But let's say if they did, and they just accepted the current proposal from Putin where, okay, they give up the Donbass, they freeze the lines everywhere else, and then it's over, it's done. Will that be the end of the West? Is that just a real tacit admission? I mean, we're spin masters. We could spin it out this way. Look, Putin would have taken all of Ukraine, exactly. And now look, so...
That's what they're saying. You're right. So I think that they should. It would be... It would be maybe acknowledgement of the limits of their power. Okay, we weren't actually able to defeat Russia. But, yeah, there are still ways of spinning it. And in fact, you see that spin machine working right now. It's like, there's always this exaggeration, this sort of the straw man that they create. It's like Putin wanted to take over all of Ukraine. He thought he could do it in 3 days or something. And Putin never saw that. It was clearly never had that intention, never stated it. But it's something that they say that he intended to do. And then they say, look how miserably he failed. And they've been losing millions of men. Again, they'll exaggerate Russian losses. And they only took, 1% or 2% of Ukraine after that initial incursion in 2022.
Right.
So that seems to me would be the intelligent thing to do. But they just seem to be incapable of even doing that, acknowledging any limits on their own power.
Okay, so if they accept the deal that's on the table now, or something similar like the Istanbul Plus or whatever, then you think that it's possible that the U.S. would preserve its hegemonic status in some sense or form, spin it as a victory. Things more or less, things have fundamentally changed in the world, but they can kind of continue semi-normally for us in the West. But,
yeah, right. It wouldn't necessarily be a fatal blow. I think there's no question that U.S. or let's say Western hegemonic prestige would be harmed, that it will have taken a loss, but it's not necessarily a fatal loss. I think, already just the fact that Russia is still standing in spite of all the sanctions, et cetera, that shows. That's already a loss that they just... They won't accept, but is real, and the rest of the world sees it. And then, after all the threats to take back all the territories and the failure to do that, well, that, even in spite of the spinning, I think most of the world will look at that and say, okay, yeah, NATO maybe isn't as powerful as we once thought. But it doesn't.
People will say it wasn't NATO. They can. People that are
in the West, they will. They'll convince themselves. I'm talking about the rest of the world that I think has a more realistic view of things. But in the West, they would do that, so they can go along, convincing themselves that they're very, very powerful, and they will have taken a loss. But it's not necessarily. It won't be a fatal loss. But the longer this goes on, in the end, the worse it is for them. So they really should take the deal now, but they just can't think that way. It's just that nobody wants to retreat from that initial position, is that we can't deal with Russia. They are not a great power and they will lose. And the only reason they haven't lost yet is just that we haven't shown, enough willpower.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I honestly think that the U.S. backing of Israel and its genocide in Gaza has been more damaging than anything that Ukraine has done so far. If we freeze it right now, would you say that? I feel like it just...
Well, I would say that's definitely true within the West.
Right, right. That's what it's,
Yeah,
yeah, within
I
the
think there's
West. Yeah.
definitely true. As for the whole world, I think it's not quite so clear. I think both conflicts have been very damaging, and I think that you have to say actually the Ukrainian conflict has done more to rearrange let's say the map of the world, the geopolitical landscape than Israel. Um, again, Russia is now very, very tight with China, and has the multipolar world, I think, is really has made great strides as a result of this, and not so much because of the conflict in Palestine. Let's not call it a conflict, the genocide in Palestine. But within the West, it seems like, again, the spin machine's done a good job, so that most Westerners, unfortunately, the majority of them believe the mainstream arguments and think that Russia is in a quagmire, that Ukraine is amazing and could turn this around any day, and so on. There are a lot of people that really believe that, both in the general population and among the leadership. But there have been real inroads. There really has been a change of attitude towards Israel, a very significant one. And when we see protests, there have been some, protests with regard to the Ukraine war in Europe anyway, but nothing of the scale that we've seen with regard to Palestine. I think there has been a real sea change, both and in Europe and in this country too.
Mm-hmm. Well, going back to Ukraine, will it get to a point where U.S., if we pause now, we said the U.S. hegemonic facade could maybe persist, but will it get to a point where, because we fail to negotiate and accept the deal that's on the table now, that it just completely just shatters any perception of U.S. hegemonic dominance or NATO dominance, economic dominance like that? We'll get to a point where it leads to essentially the disintegration of the Western systems, of our financial systems, of NATO, is that what's on the line at some point? If we stay in it too long?
I wouldn't point to any one thing, any one event. Eventually there will be a straw that breaks the camel's back, and that straw could be Ukraine. That's possible. But it's something that's happening. We've talked about the three pillars: the soft power, economic power, and military power. And all of those have been greatly weakened, and I think all of those pillars are going to eventually fall. I think there's no question about it. So I wouldn't make a firm prediction as to which one will fall first and which event will cause the collapse again of Western hegemony. But it's clear that if the U.S. It really is, the U.S. is the only one that really has the choice here. And, they don't take the offer. If they really took the offer from Russia, they could make it happen. I mean, it's at least theoretically possible, right? Because they do have the leverage over Ukraine and make Ukraine accept this. Yeah, they would be, again, U.S.-led Western hegemony would have taken a blow, but it could actually still stagger on, I think, for a while. But if they don't take the offer, and they won't, and then Russia is just forced pretty much to just continue they'll take all of the Donbass, and then go on and take Zaporozhye, which they've made quite a bit of progress actually within Zaporozhye. And then eventually they'll make the crossing into Kherson and take that. And then if they march to Odessa, and if they take, Kharkov, the city of Kharkov, and all the whole oblast of it, that's the loss is going to be obvious. It's something that they'll do what they can to spin it, but it just won't be very convincing even to their own people. The people say, yeah, you lost that. And that's going to hurt them a lot more. It is going to be a blow, and it could be the straw that breaks the camel's back.
What are you hoping for? Because part of me, I think the goal that I want, and that I think most of us should envision, is a peaceful transition to the multipolar world, where the U.S. is a willing participant in the multipolar world, that gives up its dream of U.S. hegemony, and we can show respect and cooperation towards great powers like Russia and China, and it would just be so great for the whole world. But the question is, how do we get there? It seems like the U.S. is just, is not adopting that mindset. It's viewing Russia, China, all these countries that oppose U.S. hegemony as adversaries and doing whatever they can to take them down. So part of me is like, should we wish for just complete defeat or collapse instead of a negotiated settlement? Because if we get a negotiated settlement, then it still allows the U.S. hegemonic mindset to persist and exist. And we are still in a very dangerous world because we have one rogue player, the United States, that refuses to admit reality that there are many great players and we all have to work together. Instead, it has to be my way or the highway. So how do we get there? Are you hoping that this defeat will, that there's a negotiated settlement, or are you hoping that there will be a more major defeat into some type of collapse?
Yeah.
But all of it is scary. All of it's scary.
It's all scary. That's right.
But the obvious, there's such an obvious solution. It's just to say like, hey guys, let's just stop this. China, mad respect to everything you've done, lifting all your people out of poverty and your industrial capacity. Maybe you can help us revitalize some of that here. We've clearly lost our way. Just some self-humility, some admission of errors and this willingness to work in a new world where people of different civilizations and different cultures command some respect as well, and that we can respect them and learn from each other and work together. I mean, it just seems so common sense, but we're not seeing any signs of it from the West.
Yeah, unfortunately. Yeah, no, that would obviously be the best solution. But we aren't seeing any signs. Again, Trump, we spent a lot of time criticizing, more than criticizing, ridiculing Trump, because I think he deserves ridicule often. I think there's no question about it. But from time to time, he shows a lot more. He shows that common sense. I think it's like there's part of him that understands that. And so that's why I think a lot of us were very hopeful, because occasionally he would come out and say things like that. It's like, hey, why can't we get along with Russia? Whatever. And I recently had that conversation with Putin, and I think he got convinced to say, hey, okay, Putin's made a real offer, and he made some effort. He actually had a heated argument with Zelensky, but then he backed down. It's just that you can't depend on him.
I know. And
so it's like the one guy who actually could do something and actually does show some understanding of the issues. And, like I've said, he's not a neocon. He's not really, he likes this image of a very, kind of muscular macho America, but he doesn't feel like the need to export the American way of life to the rest of the world. Let's put it that way. And he is, I think, willing to get along with some of the other great powers. Maybe he just wants to take it out on Venezuela or something. That's where which is kind of ugly and everything, I admit, but it's still, I think, a step in the right direction compared to what we had before. It's like, okay, we have our sphere of influence, so-called, in the Western hemisphere, but that's better than the whole globe. But he's the one guy that could do it, and he's just not capable. I mean, first of all, he is up against a lot. I mean, there are a lot of structural barriers. There's just so many. That is the deep state, et cetera, et cetera. But then it's also his own personality. I mean, it's both those things. So it's just not going to happen, unfortunately.
So what's your path to multipolarity, where the U.S. can be part of it as well? Is it only complete collapse?
I think so. And let's just hope that it happens. It doesn't have to be complete collapse, but I mean, there's something, we have to suffer some sort of loss on, let's say either the economic or military front, or, I think already we do see a real degradation of soft power, even within this country. Again, there's just like the percentage of people that really trust their government, think trust that our leadership has a plan to take us to a better place. That has gone way, way, way down. It has been declining for decades, and that decline is accelerating. So we really do see that soft power has declined even, within this country. But there's still this faith that a lot of people have in the U.S. military, and there's this complacency about our economic situation that is not justified. And I think there has to be a few more blows to the point where we really wake up. And I hope, I would like to think that that would lead to self-reflection and real reform within this country. But unfortunately, the tendency seems to always to look for an external enemy. We talk about the drug problem we have. And so we go after Venezuela. It has nothing to do with it, right? And that we may see more of that. It may just lead to more kind of a general flailing and demonization of more foreign enemies and more wars. That's the danger. I think whatever happens, that's unfortunately very likely, and I just hope we survive all that.
Oh boy, we need Thomas Massey to be president. Maybe he can get us out of this mess. I don't think we'll make it there. Okay, well, I think we can end there, Dad, unless there's anything else you want to talk about.
Well, no, I think that we can end there. Next time there have been interesting developments on the in Gaza, but perhaps it deserves a whole other episode.
I wasn't planning on talking so long about Ukraine. I did have some questions about the ceasefire breakdown, but I don't think we get into that. Also, I think another interesting thing is the story about China catching the NSA in this hack of their to compromise their time system, which I think was very interesting. It just because I think this exposes the world that we live in, the vulnerabilities that we have. So basically what happened is that the NSA was caught in an extended campaign between 2022 to summer of 2024, where they have infiltrated China's central time distribution center in Xi'an. And you may think like, oh, who cares if they change the time? But this thing underpins everything. They change it just 1 second. The financial systems, the rail systems, satellites, defense, telecommunications, everything can go haywire. And so just these things that we don't think about, that there are these points of vulnerability. And some of them may be vulnerable. And if things get crazy and people start wanting to, threaten people with missiles and nukes, there's always these black swan events that could happen that we may not even be aware of, that all of a sudden someone flips a switch and it's like, chaos in the streets because nobody knows, the system that one second was changed. Now the whole system's gone haywire and everybody doesn't know what to do. Electricity doesn't work. Water's not running, whatever.
Right.
So it does make you just think that there's just a fine line that separates us from chaos. And the more and more we get into this, kinetic wars and this trade wars, this posturing, that line starts to become thinner and thinner. And there's this possibility that, something could happen. And that just worries me about that, because that's kind of also the U.S. and Israel, their kind of MO is these subversions and these tiny little pain points, choke points that they can identify in different systems, Anyways, we don't have to get into it.
Okay.
And another thing,
very interesting stuff. There's plenty more to talk about.
Yeah, very
we'll do it
interesting.
next time.
I think the Nexperia thing within Europe also is very interesting. Just like how Europe just continues to just blast guns to its face constantly. With this, it's their automotive industry is in real trouble. And also, I wanted to talk about the government shutdown. Like here in the U.S. This will be my last question. All right, I know I'm starting to ramble a bit, but why do you think the government is still shut down? Because I was just listening to Colonel Daniel Davis, and he was saying that, there's always this rhetoric of like, it's the Democrats are doing this. But he's saying that Republicans themselves don't want the government to be shut down, there's signs of that as well. Do you have any?
I'm sorry, I don't have anything to say on it, but I'll make an effort to look into it. I've been focusing on other things, so I have no comment. But maybe I'll have a comment on Wednesday.
This is me just jumping to things, and just when I see things on X, it's like it's because of the Epstein files. They're like Massey's trying to get it released, and they're like, you know what? Let's just shut down the government, and then we won't release the files.
I don't think so, but
I don't know.
Okay. I don't think so.
It might be a factor. I don't know.
Anyway,
there's so many threads to pull down on these days. It's so crazy. Okay. Anyways, okay, yeah, we can end it there.
Okay.
All right. Thanks a bunch, Dad. Have a good rest of your day.
Okay.
Talk to you soon. All right. Bye-bye.